Hello, students. Welcome back to our lectures. I hope you had a great break. Where do we go from here? How can we think in useful ways about ourselves and our environment to ensure that we will be able to survive and humanity can continue on and we can do some healing in light of the situation that we have created? So, we're going to start by talking this week about ecofeminism, which is going to help us explore some of the conceptual underpinnings, some of the framework that has allowed for the current domination of nature to occur, that have led to our current circumstances, the frameworks that have led there. And then we're going to follow Warren in rethinking our relationship with nature and understanding how it connects to other forms of domination and how we can rethink those and revision, create new visions for the future of how we relate to our surroundings. So, in this week's lecture, we will start by talking about feminism, what it is, and then we will move on to discuss oppressive conceptual frameworks, because feminism is a response to sexism, and sexism is rooted in an oppressive conceptual framework. And the author will use that line of reasoning to argue that our domination of nature is also a kind of oppression that is rooted in the same kind of oppressive conceptual framework, and therefore that if we want to be good feminists, we should also be ecofeminists. That is, we should incorporate a response to environmental domination and a desire to end it and efforts to end it into our feminist philosophy. So that's it in a nutshell. So here we go. There's just a whole lot to get through in this article. There's so much going on and it's very complex. So I hope that I can help you work through the article. We'll do it together and we'll try to understand what's going on here because I think it has so much to offer for how we rethink our relationship to the environment. So we will be looking at this article, which is called The Power and Promise of Ecological Feminism, written by Karen Warren in 1990. So what is feminism? Well, feminism is the movement to end sexism, which leads to another question. What is sexism? Sexism is an existing oppressive power structure in which men play a dominant role and women play a subordinate role. So feminism is an effort to end that. Okay, so we have this power structure. We are all familiar with it. Sometimes we don't even notice it, but sometimes we do notice it. And you probably notice it especially strongly if you are a woman, because that's how oppression often works. But we have this power structure which privileges men and puts men in a position of power over women. And feminism is the acknowledgement that that exists and that it's wrong and that we should try to end it. Okay? Feminism may be more than just that, but it is at least that, Warren says. So feminist issues, what counts as a feminist issue is any issue that helps us understand sexism and relates to that power structure that gives men power over women. So Warren gives some examples of feminist issues, one being environmental degradation. Why is environmental degradation a feminist issue? Because environmental degradation is related to the power structure that subordinates women to men. She gives the example of women in India who are affected by deforestation and, by the way, reforestation. So we didn't talk as much about reforestation in the first part of the course, but reforestation is when you destroy a forest and then you plant new trees, but you plant all the same kind of trees. So you have this monoculture, single species growing where there used to be a complex ecological system. Now there's just one species. And women suffer the consequences of this differently than men because it affects their ability to maintain households that rely on the kind of diverse species that existed in the forest that was destroyed and that no longer exists in the reforested forest. Another example of a feminist issue she talks about, well, I've just talked about this, deforestation and reforestation. So this is the example of how environmental degradation impacts women differently. And water and firewood can be a feminist issue, where women are tasked with collecting water and firewood. So it's important to note that what counts as a feminist issue on this view depends on the society that you live in and the culture that you live in, and what kind of practices exist there. So water and firewood might not count as an issue, as a feminist issue in our culture, because women don't face the burden of collecting water and firewood differently than men do. But in places where they do, then it would count as a feminist issue. I've listed a whole bunch of other things that I would argue also count as feminist issues on this definition. And I will leave it to you to think through why we might consider these feminist issues. So I've written sex, higher education, clothing, sports, family structures. These are all issues that I think are related to the power dynamics between men and women. Okay, so that leads us to our next topic, oppressive conceptual frameworks. So what is a conceptual framework? First of all, she defines this as a set of basic beliefs, values, and attitudes and assumptions which shape and reflect how one views oneself and one's world. Okay, so these are the basic stuff that constitutes sort of how you think about yourself and the rest of the world. It includes beliefs, values, attitudes, and assumptions. Okay, so these are all different ways that we shape our worldview and our view of self. And a conceptual framework is the whole set of those that you embody. An oppressive conceptual framework is a conceptual framework that explains, justifies, and maintains relationships of domination and subordination. So an oppressive conceptual framework is all of those beliefs and attitudes, those basic things that constitute your worldview, which also contributes to these unjust hierarchies, these relationships where some groups are dominant and other groups are subordinate. So Miller, I hope that's her name, I gotta look it up. Warren. Okay. I don't know why I keep calling her Miller. Thinking of her as Miller. All right. So an oppressive conceptual framework has three important features, Warren argues. The first one is value hierarchical thinking. What's that mean? Well, it means that we like to think of things in terms of lists, and the stuff at the top of the list is considered the most valuable stuff. And as you work your way down the list, you get to less and less valuable stuff. Okay, so by a list, I just mean a stack, right? A hierarchical stack where you have some things above other things in terms of how valuable they are. So here's an example. We have this idea that humans are sort of at the top of this hierarchy, that humans are the most valuable things in the world, and that as you move on down through this hierarchy, you get to less and less valuable things, such as next would come non-human animals, and the more complex ones, the ones that are like us, are considered more valuable than the weirder stuff that's like floating in the ocean and more of a blob form or something, right? Like a tiger or an elephant would be considered much more valuable than like an amoeba or something. But as we keep going down this hierarchical list, we get to trees eventually, and then finally rocks, and maybe dirt is down there at the bottom. And so the idea is that we like to think of things as having these this order of value, where some things are at the top and other things are at the bottom, and some things are in between, but you can sort of rank everything in terms of how valuable it is. So this is, again, a feature, Warren claims, of an oppressive conceptual framework. A second feature of oppressive conceptual frameworks is this idea of value dualisms. So we like to think that there are these sort of dichotomies, these sort of twofold distinctions where you have two kinds of thing, and one kind of thing is more valuable. So some examples: mind and body. So we think that these are two distinct entities. There's your mind, all the stuff that goes on in your mental state, your emotions and your thoughts and your ideas, and then there's your body, like your stomach ache and the feeling that you have of your, not the feeling, the feeling's on the mind side. Your body is actually the physical stuff. So your blood and your bones and your skin and the stuff you can touch and see. Okay, so we like to think of these as two distinct things, and one is more valuable. That's what the value part of the value dualism is that the mind is more valuable than just the body. So a lot of Western philosophy tries to show, that these things are distinct, and that a being who has a mind, who can think, especially a rational mind, that's a second example, that a being who can reason, right, is more valuable, because mind and reason, these are kinds of the things that make us human, that make us special and different from the rest of the natural world, which is just bodies, right? Bodies doing whatever they are inclined to do. So another one of these dualisms is the distinction between reason and emotion. We think of these things as separate too, or at least there is a deeply entrenched Western tradition of thinking of these things as separate. Reason, the ability to sort of think through our actions. What is our goal and how can we achieve that goal? And to use deductive reasoning to understand, if you believe that Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then Socrates is also mortal. That's a paradigmatic example of reasoning. And that reasoning we think of as distinct from emotion, these sort of raw feelings that we have and how we relate to the world. And male, female, another dichotomy, another dualism that we think of as two completely distinct things, where the male is seen as dominant and more valuable than the female, at least historically in our culture. And these all go together in a way. So we see the male as partially being more valuable because of their ability to reason and their sort of identification with the mental, their minds, and the females are more embodied, more nurturing, more emotional. So the claim is not that these are actually correct identifications. The claim is that this is how women, males and females, have been conceived throughout Western history. So these are just some examples of existing dualisms that have been prevalent in philosophy, and where we value one side of the dualism, one side of this dichotomy, more than the other side. And finally, another feature of a conceptual framework is what she calls the logic of domination. And this is the most important one. And this is the one that's really important to understand in order to be able to comprehend where she's going to take us from here. So the logic of domination is the idea that some kind of oppressive framework, some kind of domination or subordination of one group to another group is justified. Okay, it's a way to reason that domination is correct, that one group ought to dominate another group. And here's how it works. Well, when we're talking about justifications, we're talking about arguments, and an argument is a set of reasons in support of some conclusion. So here's a structure of an argument. We have a number for each premise, that is, each reason given to support the conclusion. Those reasons are called premises. And then we have, following those premises, the conclusion. What are those reasons supporting? And so again, we're talking about the logic of domination. So in this case, the argument is supporting the domination of one group over another group. It's saying that one group ought to dominate the other group, or that domination is correct or justified. It's right. It's right for one group to have power over another group. That is the logic of domination. Again, this is a constitutive feature of an oppressive conceptual framework. So this is a basic way of thinking about the relations between groups that says it's proper and appropriate for one group to dominate another group. Here's an example of some of the premises that might be taken to justify domination. So The first premise, men are rational. The second premise, women are not rational. The third premise, rational people are superior to non-rational people, and therefore the domination of women by men is justified. So this is the idea that sexism is correct, right? That men are actually better in some way than women. And here their superiority, the way that they're better, is attributed to their rationality. So again, this is not an argument that we're presenting as something you should accept. This is an argument that Warren is presenting as an argument that has been taken to ground to try to justify sexism. And part of the reason why sexism exists is because this kind of reasoning has formed the basic values and assumptions of the Western tradition. Okay, so when we're understanding oppression, we have to look at the conceptual frameworks that give rise to oppression. And Warren believes that some sort of logic of domination is part of that conceptual framework. The logic of domination meaning a justification given for why it's appropriate or correct or right for one group to dominate another group. That is the logic of domination. Here's another example that we get from Ishmael. It should be familiar. The world was made for us. Therefore, we can do whatever we want to it. Okay? This is another form of the logic of domination. Another basic assumption that we take to justify the subordination of one entity to another entity. Okay, so again, oppressive conceptual frameworks have these three features. Value hierarchical thinking, that's the sense in which we order things and place more value on the stuff at the top. Value dualisms, the way we think of the world as divided into these nice, neat pairs of things, and we place more value on one of the things than the other thing. And the logic of domination, the justifications that we give for why it's okay to continue oppression, for why it's okay for one group to dominate another subordinate group. Again, it's really important that you understand these features because the rest of the work in this essay is going to build off of these features of conceptual frameworks. Okay, so the main argument of this piece is in these coming slides. The idea is the logic of domination together with the other features of conceptual frameworks. Okay, so we're talking about those three features of conceptual frameworks. They form the basis of the oppression of women and nature. Okay, so part of this argument is understanding that the domination of women and nature arises from the same basic conceptual framework. That's what Warren is claiming, and that the logic of domination is a big part of that framework. Okay, so she gives these two arguments on page 259. I'm not going to go into the details of each of those arguments, but each of them appeal to this premise, which she calls A4 in the first argument and B4 in the second argument. And the premise is, for any x and y, if x is superior to y, then x is justified in subordinating y. Okay, that is the logic of domination. And the way this works is that we say, well, and it's usually the dominant group that has this view, says, well, we are special in some way. We have this superior trait, and it makes us better than members of the other group. Like we saw that in the argument for the oppression of women, that the idea is that men have this superior quality, being rational, and women lack that quality. So therefore, men are justified in subordinating women. Okay, because this basic principle is at work here, that for any two groups, if one group is superior to the other because they have this special quality, then they are justified in subordinating the other group. Okay, and by the way, rationality has been historically used not just as a justification for the dominance of men over women, but also for the dominance of white people or the dominance of adults over children. Okay, I've spent a long time looking at arguments that adults are rational and children are not rational, and that's why adults get to make decisions for children. Okay, so this kind of logic of domination shows up all over, okay, in all different forms of subordination, all different ways that some groups have power over other groups. Because feminists reject the oppression of women, okay, remember we said feminism just is the position that seeks to end sexism, the oppression of women. Okay, since feminists reject the oppression of women, they should reject this conceptual framework that grounds the oppression of women. Okay, so the idea is that the conceptual framework, that idea that had those three features of hierarchical values, value hierarchies, value dualisms, and the logic of domination, that is the framework that gives rise to sexism. And because feminists want to reject sexism, that's what makes us feminists, we should also reject that framework, that including the logic of domination. Naturism, now she's giving us this new word, naturism, the oppression of nature. Okay, so naturism is viewed as analogous to sexism. We have the oppression of women with sexism, and we have the oppression of nature with the term naturism. Naturism is grounded in the same conceptual framework as sexism. So the idea is that because feminists are supposed to reject that framework, that's what we got from this middle sentence, they should reject naturism as well. Okay, so you have this idea that sexism is grounded in this conceptual framework that involves the logic of domination, and feminists reject that framework. Well, it turns out that that framework is also taken to ground the domination of nature, naturism. And so if you're rejecting that framework, you should also reject naturism. And that is to say that feminists should be ecofeminists. Okay, so ecofeminism is a position that combines feminism with a kind of feminist environmental ethic. Okay, one thing to note about this argument is that the conceptual framework that Warren is talking about also applies to other categories such as race, class, age, orientation, sexual orientation. And so what she's saying is that all of these kinds of oppression you should oppose if you are a feminist and you reject that oppressive conceptual framework. But it also allows that we can acknowledge that that women are oppressed. The fact that women are oppressed does not mean that women are a unified group, because women have races, socioeconomic classes, they are of particular ages, they are particular sexual orientations. There are a lot of differences that go along with being a woman, right? Not all women are the same. And so the outcome of this kind of view is that when we seek liberation, right, when we seek to end these oppressive conceptual frameworks, we should recognize those differences. We should recognize that not all women are the same, but that what they share is the way they are conceived of by the dominant group. Okay, so we have this quote from Maria Lugonis, which says, "Unity, not to be confused with solidarity, is understood as conceptually tied to domination." So the idea is that the thinking of women as a unified group is connected to the conceptual framework that oppresses them. Okay, so women are not a unified group, and we should see our liberation movements as movements based in solidarity, not unity. So what is solidarity? Solidarity is saying, I understand and appreciate your differences, but I stand beside you because we have a common goal in eradicating these oppressive frameworks. Okay, but it says I can stand beside you, and we can, stand together without making the mistake of thinking that we are the same or that we are a unified group, because there are so many differences that characterize the group called women, right? Including all these categories that I have mentioned on this slide: race, class, age, and orientation. So the idea is that we can stand in solidarity together as women who experience this conceptual framework, but who are unified only in the way that we are thought of by the oppressive group. Okay, so the idea, for example, that women are not rational and that men are rational is an idea created by the oppressor. And that is one way to think of women as a unified group, but really women are not a unified group, because there is no single characteristic that all women share, and that nobody who's not a woman doesn't share, except that women are oppressed by sexism. Okay, and so that's why we get this quote that unity is conceptually tied to domination, because the thinking of women as a unified group is connected to the oppressive conceptual framework that gives rise to sexism. Okay, and so we have a liberation based in solidarity that comes out of this, which means that we appreciate difference. We can recognize and appreciate that we are all different, that there are differences between members of one gender group, women, right? There are differences between all women, just as there are differences between members of one racial group. Between all the members of a single racial group, there are lots of differences, and there are differences between members of any socioeconomic class, and there are differences between members of a certain age group, right? Because we group these groups together does not mean that they are all the same, that all their members are the same. And in fact, the grouping itself arises out of these dominant subordinate power structures. Okay, so the reason we acknowledge that there's even a group of that it makes sense to talk about women as a group is that they have in common that they are oppressed by sexism. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this slide, and I encourage you to go back and read this section of the essay, but part of what it does is lead to a kind of liberation movement that is able to appreciate and value differences between members of a single group. Okay, and another outcome of this kind of view, because we are rejecting the conceptual frameworks that give rise to oppression, we should object as feminists to all other forms of oppression. So any time you have a power structure where one group is privileged or dominant over another subordinate group, you should reject that, according to Warren. So some examples of other forms of oppression are racism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, ageism, etc., etc. Okay, ableism is the oppression of people who have disabilities or differently abled bodies by people who are able-bodied. Ageism is the oppression of, I would argue, both younger people and older people by people who are, the privileged age, which is something like, 20s and 30s. Once you get into your 20s and 30s, you're kind of like, at least late 20s, you're kind of like, that's the age that everyone normalizes. Everyone says, like, this is what it is, this is the normal age. And if you are younger, you suffer a set of barriers and obstacles and ways that you are subordinate to older people. And if you are much older, then you also face forms of oppression that are analogous. So, and there are other examples of oppression, but these are the ones that I have named. Okay, so that brings us to ecofeminism. Okay, so just to recap, the idea is that the main argument of the paper is that sexism, that is the oppression of women by men, is grounded in this conceptual framework. And if you are a feminist, you do reject sexism. That's what it is to be a feminist. And therefore you should reject that ethical framework, that conceptual framework. But once you reject that conceptual framework, you also should reject other forms of oppression that are grounded in that framework, including naturism, which is the domination of nature. Okay, so that brings us to ecofeminism. So what is ecofeminism? It is the position that there are important connections between the domination of women and the domination of nature, and that understanding these is crucial to feminism and to environmental ethics. So we've just spent the first part of this lecture talking about what those important connections are, at least one of those important connections, that is between the domination of women and the domination of nature. And that connection is that they are both grounded in the same conceptual framework that is based in the logic of domination. Okay, so here is sort of the picture that Warren is drawing for us. So we have sexism. We're familiar with that. And we have feminism, which grows out of sexism, right? It's because we have a sexist power structure, a power structure that privileges men who are dominant and women who undervalues women who are seen as subordinate. We have feminism, which is a movement to end sexism. Well, analogously, we can think of naturism, the oppression of nature, a view that sees nature as subordinate to us, to humans. And out of naturism grows this kind of environmental ethic that seeks to, end the domination of nature. And ecofeminism is a merger between feminism and environmental ethics, one that recognizes that sexism and naturism are importantly connected. Okay, so what she's going to do next is build this ecofeminist theory to sort of explain to us what ecofeminism is and what it should be committed to. And I think in order to understand where she's going with this, it is helpful to take a little detour to look at traditional Western ethical theory in order to understand who her target is. Okay, so in developing this ecofeminist perspective, she is departing from traditional ethical theory. And she's raising a number of challenges to traditional Western ethical theory and a number of improvements to her theory of ecofeminism that she thinks are improvements over a traditional Western view. So we need to sort of focus in on what that traditional Western view is briefly in order to better understand how ecofeminism is a departure from that. So there are two main traditions in Western ethical theory, and they're opposed to one another. And if we were taking an ethics class, we'd spend at least a couple weeks talking about just these two views, but I'm going to try to rush through it in one slide in this lecture. And so the two traditional views are deontology and utilitarianism. These are sort of seen as the dominant Western ethical theories. Okay, if you take an ethics class, you will almost certainly spend a lot of time discussing these two traditions. And again, they are opposed to each other. So they are seen as sort of competitors, and they both have shortcomings that the other one seeks to remedy. Okay, so deontology we get from Immanuel Kant. And the main sort of the main law that Kant thinks sort of captures the essence of morality is this one: act so that the maximum of your action could be willed a universal law. What's that mean? It means that you should act on principles that you think everyone could follow. Right? So if you are making an exception for yourself, if you are thinking, oh, I'll just do this thing even though I don't want other people to follow my example, and in fact they wouldn't be able to follow my example because I'm making this exception just for myself, then you're doing the wrong thing. Okay? The right thing is always that thing based on principle, and you must act with recognition of that principle, understanding that you have an obligation to act according to that principle. And the principle has to be universalizable. That just means that it could be a principle that everyone else could follow as well. Okay, so what's an example? Well, Kant thought, for example, you should always keep your promises. Okay, why is that? Why does the maxim of that action, why could it be willed a universal law, right? In what sense is keeping your promises universalizable? Well, it's fine if everyone keeps their promises, right? That's possible. It's possible for everyone to always keep their promises. It's not possible for everyone to never keep a promise, or for breaking your promise to become so common that it's just you do it whenever you feel like it. Why is that not possible? Because if everyone just broke their promise whenever they felt like it, then we wouldn't be able to promise meaningfully anymore, because promising would just not have any force to it. If everyone always broke their promises, a promise wouldn't mean very much. Okay, so it wouldn't mean what a promise is supposed to mean. Okay, so breaking your promise is wrong because it does not pass this test of being universalizable. Okay, that's because if everyone did it, we wouldn't be able to make promises anymore. So that's why you should keep your promise, because that is the action that is universalizable. That is the principle. Keeping your promises is a principle that everyone could follow. Okay, that's deontology in 5 minutes or less. Utilitarianism is a different view. Okay, utilitarianism takes a totally different approach, and John Stuart Mill is a very famous utilitarian who laid out some of the basic principles of this view. And the idea is that the thing to do, the right thing to do, is the thing that will produce the greatest happiness. Okay, and happiness just means pleasure on most utilitarian views. And so the thing to do is always the thing that's just going to make everyone as best off as you can. Okay, so if you are deciding whether to go on vacation in California or Maine, you should just think which thing is going to make you the happiest. Okay, but it's not just about you. So if you are trying to decide whether to go out for a fancy dinner or donate the money to buy vaccines for children in developing countries who would otherwise die of easily preventable diseases, you should definitely donate that money to those children in third world countries, because that's going to lead to a far greater increase in their overall well-being and their overall happiness than you having one fancy dinner. Okay, so Mill says do the thing that would make the most people the happiest, the most others the happiest. And Kant says no, happiness has got nothing to do with it. Sometimes acting according to this rule about universalizability makes everyone unhappy, but you should still do it anyway, like keeping your promise, even if it's going to make you really sad, even if you have to miss out on something great, right? Because you promised to pick your friend up from the airport. You should keep your promise because that is your duty. That is, a governing principle that is part of the essence of morality. Okay, so both of these theories have, I would say, detrimental objections. Okay, they can't. Neither of them can be right. Okay, just because of some of the trouble we get into if we adopt either of these views. But what's important for our purposes is to understand what they are trying to do. And what they are trying to do is similar in each case. They are trying to give us a universal principle that we can sort of keep in our back pocket to be able to decide in particular circumstances what's the right thing to do. Okay? Kant says act on the principle that everyone could follow, and Mill says do whatever is going to make them for the most happiness. Okay, so Again, the reason we're looking briefly at these two views is because Warren is going to present ecofeminism as a departure from these two views. And so I think it will help us to understand where she's headed if we have a basic grasp of what she's rejecting. Okay, so in order to develop this ecofeminist theory, Warren starts by talking about the relevance of first-person narrative. First-person narrative is when you tell a story about your lived experience, what things were like for you, okay? Or a first-person narrator, okay? Telling a story, storytelling. And this brings out four sort of valuable things about ecofeminism. That is, first-person narrative, the idea of telling stories based on our personal experiences, brings out these four important features. One is that it helps us recognize that we are fundamentally in relationship with others. Okay, and she gives this example of the mountain climber and the way in which the mountain climber is relating to the mountain. Okay, that itself is a relationship between the climber and the mountain. And this idea that we are fundamentally in relationship brings out that relationship as central, instead of focusing on the two components of that relationship, the climber and the mountain. So traditional ethical theory, that is, environmental ethical theory, that is, people who recognize that there's a problem with how humans are relating to nature, and they try to theorize in ways that, are an improvement to how we think about how we ought to treat nature. They often grow out of those traditional Western views. So environmental ethics traditionally grows out of that Western perspective. And so some standard attempts to sort of improve our relationship with nature say, well, respecting nature is universalizable, right? Because we have to recognize that nature is sort of valuable in itself. And so we can't make an exception for nature. We can't sort of ignore that value and forget to respect nature. That would be the same problem with failing to respect another human being who's, an end in themselves, valuable in themselves. So this is one standard way that environmental ethicists try to give a better understanding of our relationship with nature and how we ought to relate to nature by using Kantian deontology to say, well, respect is a kind of universalizable principle, and it applies to nature just like it applies to other people. Okay, Kant would have totally disagreed, but this is a way to sort of capture the spirit of Kant and broaden that to include nature as something that's valuable in itself. Another way that environmental ethicists have used traditional Western theory to articulate a theory of environmental ethics is to say, well, it's all about happiness, right? Well, non-humans are also capable of experiencing happiness and pleasure. And so we should incorporate animals, non-humans, in those, at least those that are sentient, those that can experience pleasure, into our moral view. Okay, both of these theories, both of these forms of environmental ethics that grow out of traditional Western ethical views still focus on the individuals involved in these situations. Okay, so we're talking about humans as individuals and non-humans as unique individuals, and we sort of add up all the pleasure that would come from humans and non-humans on the utilitarian view, for example, and then do the thing that maximizes pleasure for all those individuals. Well, this idea, this first idea that we're talking about here, that we are fundamentally in relationship with others, focuses, instead of focusing on the individuals, in this case the mountain and the climber, they're focusing on the connection between the mountain and the climber and the attitude that the climber has towards the mountain. Okay, so I've got this picture here of a mountain climber, And whereas traditional environmental ethics would try to show why the mountain is valuable, at least some versions of environmental ethics would try to incorporate the mountain itself into a system of value based on those traditional Western ethical theories. Instead, ecofeminism, with its emphasis on first-person narrative, is going to focus on how the climber and the mountain are connected, how they are relating. Specifically, what sort of attitude the mountain climber has adopted toward the mountain. Okay, so another feature of first-person narrative, and the reason that it plays an important role in this ecofeminist philosophy, is that it gives voice to attitudes and behaviors that are often overlooked. So in the case of the mountain still, we have this idea of a contrast between an attitude of conquering the mountain, right? One that sees the mountain as something to be conquered, dominated, versus an attitude of care and love that sees the mountain as something to be appreciated and respected and cared about. Okay, so the first person narrative, one of the roles that first person narrative plays is to help us appreciate these kinds of attitudes and behaviors that are often overlooked in traditional ethical theories and traditional environmental ethics based on those Western theories of ethics. Okay, so first-person narrative allows us to appreciate the sense in which we are fundamentally in relationship with others by focusing on the relationship itself and not the individuals that comprise that relationship. And it allows us to center attitudes and behaviors that are often overlooked, such as the attitude of love and respect towards nature. First-person narrative also allows us to appreciate the particularity of ethics and ethical stories. So particularity is how our attachments and our stories are based on our relationships with particular others. So think again of these Western traditions. They are not particular in the sense that they are trying to give us, again, universal laws that we could then take and keep with us and apply no matter what the particular circumstances are. Okay, so they're trying to sort of arm us with these ways to decide what the right thing to do is that apply in any case, that apply to any person in the same situation. Okay, but this ecofeminist perspective, by focusing on first-person narrative, brings out the sense in which ethical questions and dilemmas arise out of our particular relationships. The idea is that you can't generalize to some universal theory in the way that Kant and Mill had both hoped. Instead, we have to focus on the details, the details of each particular case, because each particular case is different, okay? And the individuals that are involved in some ethical situation matter to what the outcome is, matter to what the right thing to do is in that situation. There's no one-size-fits-all ethical rule or law. Okay, and this, she says, is important because it views ethics as something that's emergent and not imposed. So by this she means that the ethical features of a situation grow out of our attention to the details of that situation. We have to be able to appreciate the details, and we do this in large part by hearing first-person narrative, by hearing people's stories about their own experience. That is what gives rise to the ethics, the ethical dimensions of that situation. It's not that ethics is some abstract rule that's imposed from above and then applied to each situation, like Kant and Mill both had us thinking. Okay, so that's what she means when she says ethics is emergent, it's not imposed. It emerges from the particular details of our lives and our experiences. It's not as if we can understand ethics and have an ethical theory that exists independently of all those particular details. Okay, and this is radical departure from traditional Western ethical theory. And finally, she thinks first-person narrative has a kind of argumentative force. That is, it suggests what the appropriate response is in particular situations based on the details of that situation. It tells us what's the right thing to do, but we have to understand the details and the particularity of the situation before we can know what's the right thing to do. But ultimately, by acknowledging that we are fundamentally in relationship and prioritizing those overlooked attitudes and behaviors and appreciating the particularity of our circumstances, there are appropriate outcomes. There are ways that are appropriate to behave in certain situations based on these features of ecofeminism. Okay, and these are all brought out by the use of first-person narrative. So first-person narrative, again, is just appreciating people's stories based on their own experiences, and it has all of these advantages. It plays this unique role within ecofeminism because it allows us to appreciate these four things. Okay, so she spends a while also discussing this idea that ecofeminism involves this shift. So back to our discussion of overlooked values and attitudes, right? It involves a shift from arrogant perception to loving perception. So encountering the world and nature in a way that's based in love and not arrogance. So think back to Ishmael again, takers and leavers, right? Leavers had this sense of belonging to the particular places where they evolved. And then takers came and had this arrogant idea that the world is just made for us and it's ours to do whatever we want with. And so ecofeminism asks us to center love and care for our surroundings instead of this kind of arrogant perspective where we have a right to do whatever we want. Okay, there are only 2 more slides, but they are big ones. So what she's going to do at the end of this essay, what she does, is she sort of shows how ecofeminism provides this framework for combining feminism and environmental ethics. And her strategy for doing that is to lay out these sort of conditions for what counts as a feminist ethic, and then showing how we can make environmental ethics feminist. Okay? And again, we should do that if we're good feminists or if we're good environmental ethicists, because feminism and environmental ethics should both reject the oppressive conceptual frameworks that give rise to the domination of women and nature. Okay, so if you appreciate the role that these conceptual frameworks play in oppression, then ending oppression requires that you recognize how all oppressions are connected, and specifically in this case, that you recognize how the domination of women and the domination of nature are connected. And so we should reject both of those because they have the same source. And the source is an oppressive conceptual framework that involves the logic of domination. Okay, so once we recognize that, once we are all on board with Warren's claims about conceptual frameworks and how they operate within oppressive systems, then we should want to make our environmental ethics more feminist, and we should want to make our feminism more ecologically minded. Okay, and so what she's doing in the last part of the essay is bringing these together. And the way she's going to do that is she's going to set out a set of conditions for what counts as feminist ethics, and she's going to show how we sort of think of environmental ethics in those terms, apply those conditions to environmental ethics to make an environmental feminist ethic, otherwise known as ecofeminism. Okay, so these are boundary conditions, and what she means by that is that she's not saying this is what all feminist philosophies, what makes them all exactly alike. Instead, she's saying these are sort of the minimal conditions that a theory has to meet in order for it to count as feminist. Okay, and she compares this to the border of a quilt. And the reason that's a powerful metaphor is because a quilt has all different kinds of patches and stuff going on inside the boundary. But it's still unified by that boundary. It's still one blanket, right? But it's a blanket that has lots of different components and lots of different styles of patches. Okay, and so she believes that's like feminism. So if you think of feminist ethics, there are lots of different types of feminist ethics. There are lots of different views, and some of them even conflict with one another. But they all count as feminist because they meet these conditions that she's about to lay out. Okay, so that's what she means by a boundary condition. And here are the 8 boundary conditions for a feminist ethic. One is that it's anti-oppressive. So it recognizes what we've been talking about. That is the conceptual links between all forms of oppression. So that includes racism, sexism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, and naturism, and more kinds of oppression than that. Okay, but that's just a few. Okay, so it's anti-oppressive in that in order to be feminist, she believes, it must recognize those links, that conceptual framework that underpins all the different kinds of oppression. And that's why if you're a feminist, according to Warren, you should be against racism and against sexism is the definitive feature of feminism, but you should also be against other forms of oppression because they have a similar root. Okay, you can think of it as chopping down the branch of a tree, right? If you want to eliminate the branch of the tree, you really have to eliminate the roots of the tree, because a lot of trees, and the tree of oppression included, will just sprout new roots unless you dig it out by the root. Sprout new branches unless you uproot it. Okay, so that's why feminist ethic is anti-oppressive on her view. Okay, it's also contextualist because it focuses on the particular contexts in which we find ourselves. Okay, so this is like what we were talking about before, where it's not trying to give us some theory or some rule or principle that applies in any context. The actual context matters to feminist ethics. So we have to focus on how we're actually embedded in those contexts and related to the others in which we are embedded with. I think that's grammatical. Okay, and it's also pluralistic in the sense that there are going to be lots of different kinds of patches in the quilt, right? Lots of different things count as a feminist ethic, and lots of different perspectives have to be taken into account. And so we're not trying to think of one view only, right? We're not trying to narrow down ethics to one particular way of thinking about ethics, like Kant and Mill were. Instead, we're trying to multiply voices and incorporate other voices. And so there are a lot of different perspectives that will be part of a feminist ethic. Feminist ethics is also what she calls a theory in process. Okay, so it's not this sort of unchanging, permanent thing. It changes and develops as contexts shift and as the pluralistic views, the different views that are incorporated also shift and change over time. So that's why feminist ethics is considered a process. It's not an end goal. It's not as if we're trying to reach something absolute and unchanging. Okay, I've already hinted at number 5. This idea that it's inclusive is related to the pluralism of number 3. It's inclusive in the sense that we want to incorporate many perspectives, as many as we can, and not just one particular outlook on life. And that is also related to number 6, this idea that it's not objective. So it's not independent of particular people's beliefs and stories, right? It's not as if there's this hard and fast rule out there and we're trying to go out and discover it. Okay? Instead, it's relative to the people who are actually involved in the theorizing and in the ethical situations that arise. Okay? And next, as part of number 6, also, this idea that it's unbiased is wrong. Okay? So we're not trying to seek some objective and unbiased view or perspective, something out there that applies equally to all people, no matter what. Instead, the feminist ethic recognizes that everyone is biased because we come at ethics with our own backgrounds and values and stories, and that shapes how we think about ethics. And the emphasis, based on number 5 of inclusivity, the emphasis for how we incorporate those biases, right? Nobody is objective on this view. We are all biased, and we're biased by our own perspectives and experiences and life stories and backgrounds. And the way to be inclusive is to use those biases to include those voices that are most marginalized. Okay, so if we approach this with the idea that we are all biased, we need to focus on using that bias to be more inclusive, to recognize that our biases have led to these dominant subordinate power structures, to these kinds of oppression, and oppression has left out some groups over others. And so in an effort to be inclusive, we should incorporate our bias in ways that center and bring a focus to those voices that are the quietest, those voices that are hardest to hear. Okay, and that is also related to number 7, that we center underrepresented values, okay, that we bring in notions like friendship and love and care, which are seen as, in traditional Western thought, which are seen as sort of less valuable, back to those value dualisms that constitute oppressive conceptual frameworks, right? We see love and care and friendship and humor and these kinds of values as rooted in our emotions and as reason sort of superior to that, right? Reason is supposed to be superior to emotion, and that's why the right thing to do, according to Kant at least, is to act on the basis of principle, right? You shouldn't let your feelings get in the way. But on this view, we value those feelings. We value feelings, the feelings that arise out of our relationships. Okay? And so those are important to ethics. They're not something to be discounted or ignored or tried to be overcome, right? We want to incorporate those kinds of feelings into our ethical framework for that framework to count as feminist. And finally, number 8, it reconceives what it is to be human. Okay, so if we think back to this Western tradition, what it is to be human is to be rational, a rational individual, rational independent individual, right? Who can sort of stand on a mountain and consider all the important details of our action and then make the right choice based on a principle that's universal. Well, on this view, in order to be feminist in your ethics, you should feminism offers this reconceptualization of what it means to be human. And to be human is not to be this independent individual who can consider all the outcomes of our choices and act on principle. Instead, that's the traditional Western conception of what it is to be human and what makes us unique. Instead, for the feminist ethicist, what it is to be human is to be intrinsically embedded in these relationships with others. And so how we relate to others and the attitudes we cultivate and the behaviors that arise from those attitudes is central, okay? And it all comes out of our existence as primarily in relationship with others. Back to the rock climber and the mountain. Okay, so these are the boundary conditions for a feminist ethic, the sense in which what it takes for an ethical theory to count as feminist. It has to meet these 8 conditions. And that still allows that there are many, many differences in different kinds of feminist ethical theories, but they all have these conditions in common. Okay, they all meet these conditions as just sort of minimally what's required in order to count as feminist. And so now what she's going to do is she's going to take these boundary conditions and show what it would take for environmental ethics to be feminist. And briefly, environmental ethics must meet all these conditions in order to count as a feminist environmental ethic, or to be ecofeminism. Okay? And again, if you are an environmental ethicist, you ought to be a feminist, according to Warren, because the oppression of nature and the oppression of women have the same source. Okay, so how do these 8 boundary conditions apply to environmental ethics? Well, for environmental ethics to be feminist, Warren thinks it has to be anti-oppressive, in the sense that it recognizes the connections between all sorts of oppressions and is opposed to all of them and seeks to undo all kinds of oppression. Okay, it's contextualist, in the sense that context matters. Okay, so we're going to move on to read Braiding Sweetgrass, and we're going to see how context matters. We're going to see people's relationship to particular places making a difference to how they think ethically about those places. It's pluralistic in that it accommodates a lot of different kinds of views. A lot of different types of environmental ethics can count as feminist environmental ethics. It's also in process, right? It's ever changing. It's not a constant thing that's unchanging. Instead, it's always developing and shifting as the context changes and as the relationships change and as people's particular values and attitudes change. It's inclusive in the sense that it seeks to incorporate a broad set of ideas and opinions, especially those ideas and opinions that have been silenced or marginalized. It is not objective in the sense that it's not seeking some independent view from above, right? It's inherently connected to our unique perspectives, including our biases based on how we were raised, or our backgrounds, or our particular values. It centers underrepresented values. Okay, part of its inclusivity is that it brings out these voices that haven't been heard and the things valued, such as friendship and love and care, like we said in the case of feminism. And that doesn't mean that it denies the relevance of more traditional values, more traditional ethical concepts that were seen as sort of superior. Back to those value dualisms again, right? We thought we traditionally viewed things like rights and principles and rightness and wrong, right and wrong. These have been central values within Western ethical theory. Well, for an environmental ethics to be feminist, it has to center more values than that. But it can also have a place for those traditional values. Again, it depends on the context. Which values are going to be most important is affected by what's actually going on, the details of the particular situation. And finally, the feminist environmental ethics will also reconceive of what it means to be human, like Ishmael says, right? We need to rethink our story. We need to rethink the myth that places humanity at the top of this hierarchy, right? As if all of nature exists for us and we are outside of nature. Instead, it views humans as essentially embedded as a member of these ecological systems. Okay, and related to others, including the land that we live on. Okay, so that is ecofeminism in a nutshell. Okay, she writes at the end, she thinks the power and promise of ecological feminism, that's the title of this piece, is that we reconceive and revision both feminism and environmental ethics. Okay, and one thing that she notes at the very end, which I think is so important, is the idea that you might think that you can be an environmental ethicist, right? That you can care about the environment and seek to end the destruction of nature without being a feminist. But she says to do that is to miss that naturism, the domination of nature, and sexism have the same origins, and therefore that the domination of nature is grounded in this hierarchy that puts men in power over women. So sexism is part of our oppression of nature. And therefore, if you think you can undo the oppression of nature, if you think you can eradicate naturism, right? If you can liberate nature from the dominance of humanity without attending to feminism, then you're just perpetuating that sexist power dynamic as it plays out in humankind's domination of nature. Okay, so there's a quote here. Find it. It's on page 267. And it says, in contemporary sex-gendered, raced, classed, and naturist culture, an unlabeled position functions as a privileged and unmarked position. Okay, so if you think you can just be an environmentalist without thinking about sexism or without recognizing that connection, then because we live in a sexist culture and because sexism is part of the domination of nature, you are continuing that perpetuation of nature. It's just like you can think you could be colorblind, right? If you're a white person, you might think that the goal of ending racism is just to be colorblind, not to think about race. But actually, even as a white person, when you don't have to think about race that much, you are acting as if your position in this hierarchy has no marking, right? You are not even making yourself part of a category because you're seeing yourself, if you're a white person, as sort of the dominant part of that hierarchy. But you are very much a part of a group within that hierarchy, even though it may not feel like it, because oppression is often easier to spot when you are a member of the oppressed group rather than the dominant group. Okay, so if you think you can just go through the world not being a racist, for example, and you are in a position of power within a racial hierarchy, that is, you are a white person within existing racial hierarchical structures, then you are actually perpetuating racism by trying to ignore race, okay? Because racism is part of how the world has been built. And so we have to acknowledge racism in order to make efforts to undo it. So in the same way, if you think you can just ignore sexism and focus on saving nature, right, from humanity, you're perpetuating sexism as you do that, because sexism is part of how nature has come to be dominated by humanity. Okay, that is at least the ecofeminist perspective that Warren is laying out. Okay, so trying to ignore these hierarchies, thinking they're irrelevant for something that feels separate or far away, is actually perpetuating the hierarchy, because the hierarchy is operating even within this other framework that we think is distinct. Okay, I saw a meme recently that said, remember, white supremacy is the water, it's not the shark. Okay, so this is one way to think about this point, I think, is that we are in water that is characterized by these oppressive frameworks. And so if we try to ignore them, then we're just going to keep on allowing them to continue. And instead, we need to acknowledge that they are all interconnected and that they shape one another. Okay, so our domination of women shapes the domination of nature. And I think that's the last slide. Yep, that was a lot, and I hope that you will ask questions, and I hope that I have helped clarify a complex article. And we will be using some of this material now to rethink and revision what our relationship to nature could be. And part of that strategy will be to multiply possibilities, in part by looking at science fiction, in which authors try to imagine possible futures, to rethink where we're headed and write ourselves into the future, something you will be doing, in a way that we want to go, right? That we can be intentional about choosing a path that works for us, that is better for everyone. And so, so this lecture provided some of the conceptual framework for how we're going to proceed to revision our lives and our place in the world and our relationship with the environment. So, thank you for listening, watching this lecture, and I will see you soon. Okay, for this week's journal entry, you should get a blank page of your journal, and in the middle, draw a circle. And in that circle, write your name. And then, this is my name, draw 5 lines coming out from the circle. And then at the end of each line, draw another circle. And then in each of these circles, I want you to write the name of a group that you're a part of that's an important part of your identity. What? Because the thumbs up just came on my screen. All right. I don't know why that happened, or if you all saw that, but all right. So for example, I am queer. That's a big part of me. I am Jewish. I am a single parent, a professor, and a Durhamite, because I live in Durham. So here are mine, and you could do the same for you. And then this is journal entry 7, I believe. And then after you've done that, I want you to write about 2 experiences. So for the first experience, think of something positive that has happened to you or that you've felt, a positive feeling that you've had because of your membership in one of these groups. So one positive experience, sometime when being a member of that group felt good to you. Maybe it was because somebody else in the group did accomplish something and you felt pride of being associated with people who were giving a positive image to the group. Or anything that you can think of that relates to your own life and your own identity, these important parts of your identity, the groups you belong to. One experience that's positive, it can be from any of these groups. You don't have to think of one for each group. And then one experience that was negative, a negative experience that you had as a result of your membership in one of these groups. Maybe somebody did something bad that you didn't like, and because you were associated with them, or maybe somebody judged you or stereotyped you because of the group that you belong to when the stereotype doesn't hold true in your case. But whatever it is, write about it in your journal on the next page. So you'll have a page with your name and the 5 groups that you belong to that are important to you and who you are. And then you'll have another page where you're writing a positive experience and one negative experience. No, that's okay. See ya.